Morgan Levy. I'm from the Denver Skeptics Society, and I don't recognize a lot of your faces. I thought maybe we could get more people from Denver down here, but hopefully in the future we can get people up there and down here better. But there are a few familiar faces out there. But I probably need to just tell you basically who I am, but also I want to just get a little bit of feedback from who you guys are. Just do that about 1 minute or maybe 3 minutes. And then we're going to see an 8-minute video. And at the end of the 8-minute video, we're going to open it up for questions. So my name is Morgan Levy. I'm a psychiatrist. Actually, I'm a UCLA NPI geriatric neuropsychiatrist. So what I do is the brain behavior stuff. I'm an Alzheimer's disease researcher. So we look at demonstrable brain injury and the behavior that results as a result of that. But also, I'm a hypnotist. I'm actually the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis hypnotist. Also, I'm a magician. I've done a lot of professional magician shows. So, and also a psychiatrist. So I basically have done a lot of the stuff that you would do in order to understand why and how people believe, weird things. So what we're going to talk about today is this neuroscience of belief. But before I do that, let me just ask the audience a couple of quick questions since a lot of you aren't familiar with me. Is there anybody in the audience who has any sort of degree or advanced degree in either genetics, anthropology, or neuroscience? Okay. Just in case, just to check and see if everybody know whether I was telling the truth or not. And also, I sent out this video in email in advance of this meeting. So, has anybody actually seen this video? It's my 8-minute video that I sent out to advertise this talk. So nobody's really seen it? Okay. It's an 8-minute video. It's packed with information. And there's a lot of things in here that you might have questions about. So when the video's over, ask questions. If nobody asks questions, I have a list in Reed's hand, and he'll ask questions. So if Reed has to ask questions, that means as an audience you failed. But anyways, just watch the video and then ask questions.
The human species does do religion.
So anyway, I can adjust the volume.
Most people believe in a slightly counterintuitive, invisible being and a set of rules on how to get along. Why is that? Oh, come on. Animals aren't programmed to do certain predictable behaviors, are they?
So we have a scarlet macaw named Nikki. Nikki has a little bitty brain that was programmed in the Amazon rainforest for the purpose of picking nuts and berries off of trees and bushes. However, we have Nikki in my bedroom in Denver, Colorado. So we give Nikki toys made out of wood and leather. She plays with these toys and she's able to exercise her innate brain program. And she's perfectly happy and perfectly healthy. So this is our big, beautiful scarlet macaw, Nikki. And you can see how healthy she is, because she gets to play with lots of toys. On the other hand, here is a poor scarlet macaw who doesn't get to play with toys. This scarlet macaw is very unhappy and very unhealthy, and even plucks its own feathers out.
Well, I hope this analogy isn't too harsh, but here's a Roman Catholic playing with a rosary. The Turkish people call it a misbah, or in Hindu it's Jakomala. Anyways, you get the point.
Okay, forget for a moment that we made up a whole bunch of silly stories about God and Jesus. I'll come back to that in a moment. The thing is that genetically, we are an unusually homogeneous species that evolved the ability to network our brains as a survival strategy. Religion is fundamentally about strengthening that network. It is about being social. It is about teamwork.
When we do things like singing, chanting, dancing, touching, dressing alike, lighting candles, burning incense, and doing rhythmic behavior in unison, we stimulate the release of regulatory neurotransmitters in our brains, such as serotonin, dopamine, adrenaline, acetylcholine, endorphins, and oxytocin, from subcortical nuclei that are connected in a feedback loop to the newly evolved prefrontal cortex, where social behavior is coordinated.
The reason that our social programming looks so funny now is that it evolved when we lived out on the savannah in small groups of hunters and gatherers. But it is now being used in large agrarian societies where there's kings and priests and rules to follow for everybody to get along. The really cool part is that now we have technology that can actually see inside the brain how it functions when information is being processed. We can actually see which circuits are linked together and networking with other brains in other humans. For example, meditation is a classic religious behavior where you try to get your own brain in sort of a state where you're communicating either with God or with other people or something to that effect. Now, let's actually look inside the brain and see what's happening when you are meditating. For example, here is a SPEC image, a functional brain image, that demonstrates how the frontal lobe of the brain is more active when you are meditating. Okay, let's look at the picture bigger. Okay, now here's a second image. In this image, what we're seeing is the parietal, back part of the brain, that's less active when you're meditating. Okay, now let's see this image a little bit bigger. Okay, so let's actually look inside of a brain and see where the circuits are that do religion. That is, the circuits that do social behavior. First of all, here's a brain, and it's in the prefrontal cortex. Cut the brain in half. This is the prefrontal cortex. This is where the subcortical nuclei are. They project to the prefrontal cortex in a feedback loop. That's the part of the brain that communicates socially. That's the part of the brain that does religion. Now, consider these 3 points about how our brains are organized. First, our brains come pre-programmed. These programs are not good at critical thinking, but they are good at rationalizing things that are observed. Number 2, we have the unique and recently evolved ability to synthesize auditory, visual, olfactory, tactile, respiratory input, and these relatively young synthesizing circuits can be fluid. Number 3, if we are going to organize as a team to deal with things like thunder, rain, drought, volcanoes, eclipses, stuff like that, then we need to all agree on causal explanations for these, random events.
So, here are some Taoist priests in the city god temple of Shanghai performing rituals. Now think about this. Our senses misperceive something where a random event occurs and our brains rationalize it collectively. This is done within the context of innate programming that is designed to do social bonding, which includes thinking and behaving in unison.
In regards to the silly stories, it seems as though there were some geniuses in this who created a bunch of pseudo-logical mumbo-jumbo to heap onto the natural, innate way we were doing religious behavior. Thus, and here's the big conclusion, most modern religions are complex rationalizations that use a causal agent, for example, a god, modeled after a king, to explain why we feel good when we exercise our innate social program.
This is actually the first time I've actually shown this to an audience, and so what I want to do is generate questions. So now I'm going to find out if that happened. Yes.
I wish I could give you a reference, but I heard a podcast recently where someone like you who is exploring the brain says there is actually a religious center in the brain, and it's caused the evolutionary path that got us this part of the brain was when the human being became self-aware and was self-aware that he was going to die, or the race or the person was going to die, that it was a natural response to remove the anxiety to say, well, there's a life beyond dying on the ground kind of thing. Are you aware of that?
Well, there's this guy named Michael Persinger who sort of pretends to be a neuroscientist, but he's a total nutcase. And he was the one that had this God helmet, back in the 90s. And he claims that he's found, a sort of God center in the brain. But you understand that the God helmet, what he was using was ordinary household magnets, and he was putting it on this helmet. And the idea was that these magnets would somehow affect your temporal lobes and cause you to experience God. And he figured out that was where the God is centered, or the God is centered in your brain has a localization that that does God. Right? It's just total crap. It doesn't mean any basis in reality whatsoever. First of all, we, on a routine basis, put people in 3 to 6 Tesla magnets when we do MRIs, and of course this doesn't happen. So what household magnets have no effect on your temporal lobes. The magnetic field from a household magnet doesn't even penetrate through your skull into your brain. So a household magnet put on your brain and your skull has no effect whatsoever on your brain. So the whole Persinger's whole thing is just just complete garbage. But was there another part of that question though that you'd like to answer?
Well, this one was really that there's the anxiety, that humans have an anxiety about death that most animals don't seem to have.
Well, and in regards to that, that's a more interesting question that I would rather answer. Humans have a location in our brain that most species don't have, and that's the prefrontal cortex. And the particular part we're talking about is the orbital frontal, right above the eyes, prefrontal cortex. And when this location in your brain is damaged, you get your social behavior becomes damaged. And so we've studied this extensively over the years, and we know that this feedback loop system between the prefrontal orbital frontal cortex and the basal ganglia, this feedback loop system is the system that in humans gives us this ability to be a social animal. If you think about it, there's no other animal on the planet that's capable of understanding what other individuals in its own species are thinking and feeling. I mean, my wife knows what I'm thinking all the time. How does she do that? Somehow we are an unusually social animal. I mean, like spiders spin webs and bats do sonar, humans do complex language for the purpose of social behavior. And the idea is that, when we were 6 million years ago, when we were chimpanzees in the trees, there wasn't social behavior. There was a dominant alpha male, and people just were selfish, and they, but when we got out onto the prairies and started running around in hunting-gathering groups, we started to be more social because out on the prairies, there was a lot more weather changes, and we evolved a lot quicker, and a lot of us died more frequently, and a lot of us didn't survive. And of course, Homo sapiens are the only hominid that actually did survive. how did we survive? Well, one of the ways we survived is in the last 6 million years, somehow we developed these huge brains with these prefrontal cortexes that do this social behavior. And so, if you think of it that way, that means that this circuit in the brain is what does that social behavior. And as the social behavior evolved, other aspects to increase that also evolved. So we sort of, as our biology evolved, our culture evolved. They evolved at the same time. And so you can't really separate culture from biology frequently. I mean, culture is done in different ways in different locations, but basically the underlying genetically programmed brains are still the same. I mean, we're 7 billion people on the planet, and we all basically have brains that are programmed pretty much the same way. Even broken brains are programmed like other broken brains that are broken in the same way. I mean, our brains are, it's one human brain. That's why I asked the question earlier, why do people all over the planet do these paranormal, believe in these same paranormal things? People in Australia and people in Denver believing in the exact same paranormal, because it's human brains that are creating it, and it's the same brain, with the same programming, right? So when you look at our social programming, and you look at the part of the brain that's doing our social programming, that's why I say that's the part of the brain that does religion, because religion is the ultimate social group. I mean, just like this group here, we're all here, and we all sort of agree on a set of ideas that we kind of, it's what brings us here, and we're sort of a group, and we maintain contact. I mean, this is what humans do. We run in groups. We run in little, you can think of a group of humans like a little football team. We like to run around in football teams, and we like to be really altruistic within our own team, but we like to kick the other team's butt. And that describes how our brains were programmed and what we did. That was probably way more than that question asked. I'm sorry, I think somebody over here raised their hand next. Yeah.
The brain scans, the SPEC scans that you were doing, is that from Andrew Newberg's work?
Yes.
One part.
Yes.
Second part, I know a lot of his work focuses on meditation and what happens during meditation. And one of the things is that there are certain parts of the brain that the reception of information is shut off. And he believes that that's where that feeling of oneness comes, that you're a part of everything because you kind of stop being able to sense where you begin and where everything else starts. So if religion and beliefs such as that are part of innate social programming, where would something like that come into play? Because by nature, meditation, most of them are secluded. They're away from social. It's a very internal ability that they're gaining to be able to shut off that part of their brain. Where's the explanation for that?
It's a very complicated question. I'm not exactly sure I understand.
The ability for somebody, for one, you have to train yourself to shut off that part of your brain. It just doesn't come back.
You say that part of your brain. What do you mean?
I can't remember what that part is.
Well, let me just tell you a little bit about Andrew Newberg. Okay. Andrew Newberg is somebody who does neuroscience for the purpose of studying religion. And he was, I think, at Pennsylvania. But really, nobody else really does that. I mean, there's a few scattered people, but he's really kind of the only person doing that. And the person that mentored him was Michael Person. So he's not somebody I completely trust, but he certainly is doing neuroscience way more legitimately than Michael Person did. I mean, he's using the right language, and he's getting published in the correct textbooks and stuff. I mean, the correct places and whatnot. But still, I think he's somebody who is basically religious and wants to prove that God does exist. Mm-hmm. So I think, I'm not positive. I've never met him. I don't know him. I'm just kind of speculating. So, but when I read his stuff, I see some stuff that looks like kind of legitimate. Like, for example, the images that I showed you. I think that's a legitimate use of functional imaging. But his conclusions from it, I think, are a little bit speculative, and I'm not sure I would go that far.
Well, it's basically understanding the biology of what's going on behind somebody's experience is what I read it as far as its justifications, I don't really recall. But what he sees is that when someone is a very well practitioner of meditation, they're able to do that. I mean, if somebody just trying to meditate for a few minutes is not going to be able to produce those brains.
No, you have to be practiced. The brain scans that I showed were from people that were practiced meditators. In other words, you can train your brain to do, we know now that your brain isn't just hardwired, that your brain is actually plastic and can change over time. For example, you could have depression, and we could do obsessive compulsive, and you could have depression, and we could do cognitive behavioral therapy for 6 months. And 6 months ago, your brain, the front part of your brain was not very active. 6 months later, the front part of your brain is active again, and it's with no medication, simply from doing cognitive behavioral therapy. We know that we can make changes, and so, for example, we know if you spend 6 months learning how to meditate, meditating every day, practicing it, 6 months ago, these images would look like a normal brain. But now these images, you can see the difference, the decrease in the front part of the brain and the increase in the parietal, or vice versa, whichever it was. And so you can practice, and you can change the way your brain is functioning to some extent. So the way I kind of describe it is that these circuits, like the circuit that does social behavior or the circuit that does religion, I think, and this is complete speculation, but I think if you look at all humans, there's probably a bell-shaped curve of how these circuits are structured, so that, for example, one individual might have been born with a brain circuit, that was on this end of the bell curve, and I'm maybe over on this end of the bell curve, and so this person is very, very religious, and I'm very, very skeptical. So I think the less active, or the less strong, or the less sensitive to neurotransmitters, or the less robust this circuit is, the more you're able to sort of dissociate yourself from the natural human programming that your brain is supposed to do, and think independently and critically. But not very many people can do that. Probably 90% of most people are pretty bound to thinking the way our natural programming thinks. And so,
a lot of them are lazy thinkers.
Well, it's not about a matter of being lazy thinkers. It's a matter of thinking according to how we're programmed to think. And very few of us can really think outside of that program. I mean, even I think I can think outside of our program, but I really can't, I'm still really bound, I want to speak in front of you, and I want positive reinforcement. I don't want you guys being mad with me, right? I have natural brain programming that wants the same. I want to eat, I want to have sex, I want to go to the movies, I want to swim, I want to do normal things that my programming tells me that I want to be doing, right? So even me, I'm not completely outside of my programming, but hopefully I've spent a large part of my life training my brain to be scientific, and training my brain to be critical, and training my brain to behave not in a human way. But our brains don't have natural critical thinking programming. Our brains have great rationalizing programming, but horrible critical thinking programming. Again, that probably went way beyond that question, but there's a lot of hands, but I'm
I
just
just
going
wanted
to
to ask
say.
you, because it was a quick follow-up,
Yeah.
which I heard, I think, a lot easier one to answer.
Okay, great.
I got confused with those scans, that I wasn't sure if you were comparing the meditative brain, or the parts of the brain that were used in that with the religious/social parts, if they were contrasted or being compared. I just wasn't clear.
No, I wasn't contrasting or being compared.
Oh.
But the example was, your point that meditation is done in isolation, I disagree with that. I think meditation is a very social behavior. What you're trying to do when you meditate is you're trying to talk to a dead relative, talk to God, talk to other
There's a vet monk in a cave in the middle of nowhere.
Very different from that.
What?
Yeah, it seems like
Meditation
that's a
varies
narrow
very much
view
different
of-
from what you're
of
referring to.
Okay, tell me what it's about.
Well, from what it's more about being in tune. Well, I guess it isn't looking relative, being in tune with your surroundings.
And part of it's not
you
thinking at
can make
all.
a connection there.
Well, in fact, they want non-attachment is the key, so not having family, not having a social structure is their key. It's total, they're trying to isolate themselves for
Right.
everybody.
It's a set of ideas and principles they've spent a lifetime learning from other people to be fit into their social group. Their whole social group has learned all of these ideas and rules and regulations, and now they're doing the meditation. Okay, you're not understanding this. Let me explain it in a different
Well, it
way.
seems like, I can only go from my experience. My limited experience meditated wasn't something someone else suggested to me. Certainly I had to get input somewhere, but it's something I did on my own, and I would, in a lot of ways, just try to not think about anything, which is much harder than anyone would ever believe if you haven't tried to do that kind of meditation. And so then it's hard to connect that with, I think, similar to what she was saying, the social aspect.
Isolated.
Yeah, that's
Well,
right.
the statement you just made is exactly what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
It was very difficult to not think of anything.
Right.
Your brain is programmed, and your brain is not only pre-programmed before you were born, but your brain also is adaptive. And so it learned cultural stuff, right? So it's just like with language. You know, we're programmed to do language, but we're not programmed to do English. Right? So we're programmed to do language, but as we grow up in our culture, our brains adapt and learn how to do English, right? Well, it's the same thing with social behavior. Our brains are programmed to be social, but then we're born into a context and we learn a specific social behavior in that context, right? So as you learn that social behavior, now at this point in your life, your brain is not only pre-programmed from when you're born, but now you've got a lifetime of cultural, your brain living in this culture and living in this world. So you don't have a brain that just can do anything. You have a brain that does certain stuff, right? So when you go to try to meditate, how do you completely divorce yourself and not use your human programmed brain? I mean, you are using a brain that is not only pre-programmed, but it's also been influenced by everyone you've ever known in your culture and your everything. So you are actually meditating in a social environment. Your brain isn't separate. Our brains are connected. We have 5 sensory modalities. And our sight, hearing, smelling, taste. And through those 5 sensory modalities, all of our brains are connected together. That's what makes our species weird and unique. And that's what I mean by we're a social animal. When we're connected like that, you just can't exist independently. I mean, there's a few people like Ted Kaczynski that go out and, don't exist socially, but he comes back and does some weird social behavior. but basically, if you are a Tibetan monk and you spend a lifetime learning all of the principles that you're supposed to do and be and think when you're a Tibetan monk, and then you're meditating on all of those same principles. I mean, your meditation is not in isolation. It's impossible to really step outside of our programming and really be independent and do things that are independent. And we're sort of bound, I mean, for example, this is a Mac. I'm a PC guy. I cannot figure out how to get that thing up there. I mean, it's a Mac. I can't expect it to be a PC. Okay? You're born with the brain that you're born with, and you can't just step out of it and do whatever you want. Whatever you're doing with that brain, including meditating. So in that sense, meditating is still a social behavior. It's still influenced, by genetically and culturally everything that went to create the current brain that you have.
I've got another question about the plasticity of the brain. As someone with a behaviorist background and someone who does a lot of ridiculing people on YouTube for crazy religious practices, I'm wondering how you feel ridicule can be effective in breaking the dopamine addiction.
As fun as it might be.
Yeah, I'm wondering how effective it can be in breaking that addiction to prayer in the brain when people have been ridiculed for praying the gay away or praying that the country gets a better economy or praying for rain. When they go back to their prayer, after years of being in an insular community in a church that doesn't ridicule them, when they finally do come across ridicule or even just alternate facts, how effective can we be in creating that cognitive dissonance to help them break from that addiction to prayer?
Well, you can try all you want, and it's fun to try. And I applaud your effort, and I certainly applaud the idea of your effort. But you're not just going to go up to Jerry Falwell and convince him that God doesn't exist. It's just not going to happen. For example, my niece married this guy who's extremely intelligent, extremely rational, and we're having a conversation about all this stuff. And then at the end, he's totally involved in the conversation, and I totally think that he's a total atheist, a total free thinker, a total critical guy. And then at the end of it, he goes, "Oh, but aliens exist." I mean, you can't not believe some things that's dumb. For example, I have a really stupid belief. I think if I just talk long enough, people will start not believing this crap.
I'm there with you.
That's a fantasy. I am delusional. So even even this group, even the collective thoughts that we have that bring us together in this group, some of those thoughts may not be accurate.
Just a question, and I may be out on a limb here, but it seems to me there's sort of this, in religion, it tends towards the extreme. You know, there's like this evolutionary arms race in religion. And that may or may not be the case, but is there a connection there with the brain kind of thing?
Yeah, the race, the religious arms race is actually a unique American experience. Most countries have a national religion, so they don't have competitive religions. But we have 250 years of having competitive religions operating in a free market society. So religions compete. And so we now know that there's a natural evolution of a religion. It first starts out trying to get recruits. And so it really works to try to get recruits. Then it gets big if it's successful. And then it kind of mellows out. And because it's mellow, and other competing religions are running after trying to get recruits, then it eventually goes down, right? So if you look at every religion that has been in the last 250 years, I mean, none of us are still Quakers, and none of us still do the religions that they came over in 1776 with. You know, the Methodists were huge Bible thumpers 150 years ago. And then in my generation, they were kind of huge and sort of mellow. And now they're on their way out. That's sort of the natural evolution. And in America, Protestant religions, and there's zillions of them, you know, they compete. And so that may be true. Go to Russia, where everybody's Russian Orthodox, or go to Mexico, where everybody's Catholic, or go to these countries that have state religions, and not so much. Was there another part of that question I forgot?
Well, yeah, just because now that we're a global world more connected than ever, now we're competing with worldwide religions, and of course the more extreme Muslims and stuff. I guess there's a fear factor there that the most extreme will win out.
Yeah, and the thing is, the extreme factor, I would argue, really isn't about religion. Among humans, there's a bell-shaped curve of how willing you are to be radical. And there's only about 5 or 10%, or maybe even 2% of human beings that are really willing to be radical. But those that are willing to be radical are very loud, and they sometimes take over. For example, there's some tea thing that's taking over us right now. You know, so basically those few radical, loud people tend to dominate the headlines, but the vast majority of us aren't them. And I don't think it has anything to do with religion. I think it's more political and socioeconomic, and you know, it's who we are. There's just a certain, and it may be, my suspicion is that it might be individuals that have like a huge, massive, strong social behavior, frontal executive system network that, you're not going to convince them that all this stuff isn't real. So that's just my conjecture, yeah.
Me? No. I have a question it's off the list, but
that's all right.
Has there been any research to show that rituals or other behavior reinforcing that innate programming that you mentioned? Or let me rephrase that. Has there been any research to show that rituals will reinforce innate programming versus abstaining from those rituals and having that innate programming become weakened somehow from that?
Yeah, it's really not about doing rituals. I mean, certainly rituals are a human thing, and we do rituals. But let me explain to you about religions. The way we normally do religion, or the natural, endogenous way to do religion, isn't the way the Catholics do it, and it isn't the way the Islamic people do it. These are modern religions that have had 5,000 years of written language to cogitate and add a lot of crap onto these religions, right? I mean, if you think about Catholicism, Catholicism is as anti our innate programming as we are. I mean, basically, Catholicism figured out everything that the human brain does innately and said, either we're going to control that or don't do it. And if you actually go to a church, the people that are the most religious tend to be the ones that are least educated about the religion, and they tend to be doing it in a human way with human programming. They tend to be ignoring what they're actually supposed to be doing as Catholics. People like me that are sort of anti-Catholic are people that are the individuals that generally know the most information about the Catholic Church. I mean, my brain is filled with information about the last 2,000 years of Catholicism. But my wife, who's a huge Russian Orthodox individual, you ask her any question, she doesn't have a clue. You know? She's just doing it in a natural way she does it. And one of the insights to how we normally do religion is there are three societies that are kind of still around. They're not really still around, but they're kind of still around. That are examples of indigenous people. The Australian Aborigines is the most famous example, but there's a couple of other examples, one in Africa and I think one in Asia. And these individuals were kind of separated from the rest of us for 40 or 50,000 years, and only rediscovered in the last couple hundred years. But because of disease and stuff, we really, the only ones that survived were the ones that had sex with us and got some of our genes in them. So there's only kind of partial ones that are actually alive now. But there's still Aborigines that are practicing their indigenous, indigenous cultures, and they're doing their indigenous religion. All three of these geographically isolated groups of people that are doing indigenous religion are doing it the same way. And the way indigenous, and so we think this is how they must have done it 15,000 years ago when we were hunter-gatherers before we had large agrarian societies. And the way they do these indigenous religions is, it usually lasts for at least an overnight, usually for 2 or 3 days. But you sing, chant, dance, there's no priest or shaman, it's a group activity, there's fire, there's chant, everybody's singing something in ritual, everybody's dressed the same way, the same face paint, everybody's moving in the same way, and you do this till you pass out, or you become overcome with the smoke or the incense, and then you see God, or you see a dead relative, and you have some weird experience, right? And the way I kind of describe it is, what you're doing is a mechanism for stimulating your natural brain chemicals to sort of create a drug-like experience. I mean, it's kind of like if you're addicted to a drug, you do cocaine on a regular basis in order to have dopamine flood your brain. Well, you're doing this behavior until dopamine floods your brain, and then you have this religious experience, right? And so that's kind of how indigenous religions are. So when you look at modern religion like Catholicism, that's had all this time to sort of heap all this extra stuff onto it, you can still see in Catholicism, they light candles, they do rituals, they sing, but maybe like in my Orthodox church, they seem very monotone, but they stand and do incense, and they try to get a little lightheaded during the service, so that so they try to do some of the basic fundamental religious stuff. But the modern religions are really kind of bastardized versions of the way we're supposed to be doing religion. So
well,
now,
I would think that some of the modern religions, like the Pentecostals, with
it's still Southern Baptist
gyrating and feeling the Holy Spirit, I would think that would be similar to the old tribal religions.
They're trying to do it a lot more like, and in fact, if you go to a Catholic church, most of the people in the Catholic church aren't trying to do real Catholicism. They're really trying to do the natural indigenous religion that is encoded in your DNA. My wife, she's not a Christian. She drinks, she loves jewelry, she gets sex like a rabbit. She believes in spirits and Tao cards. A third of the things on the anti-skeptic list, she firmly believes in. And the Catholic Church would totally, or the Orthodox Church would totally say you're not supposed to believe in that stuff, right? So she's really behaving in church with her natural indigenous programming to do religion. That's what she wants to do, and that's what makes her feel good, and that's what she does. But she isn't cerebral. She doesn't understand the rules and what you're supposed to be doing and how the church really is organized. You can ask her any question about the church, she can't answer it. But she goes every Sunday, and she feels really good.
Yeah, about what you were just saying, I read a study like a year ago saying that people that fast will get those kind of
Exactly. Yeah, fasting is a great way to produce chemicals in your brain that give you these drug-like, experiences, and then you think you're seeing ghosts or you're seeing dead relatives or whatever.
And there was another question I had before, which is I've heard that neuroscience is the new battleground for science versus religion.
Yeah, absolutely. Neuroscience is where the meat is. One of my heroes is Michael Shermer, who wrote the book, Why People Believe Weird Things. And I actually had dinner with him recently, and we had this conversation. But, I love him, but he's not a neuroscientist. His most recent book, however, he finally has delved into neuroscience. It's called The Believing Brain. Highly recommended. And he delves into neuroscience, but he's not really a neuroscientist, so he doesn't get it exactly correct. He does a pretty good job. It's definitely a good read. What was the question I was answering?
I was just going to ask if you found that in your field or not.
Oh, yeah, so yes, yeah. So what I would say to guys like Michael Shermer, and to you guys who are doing all this skeptic stuff, is the thing that is the essence of what you want to be doing is the neuroscience, the brain stuff. Figure out how the brain works and how the brain works when people are doing. And this talk I'm talking right now, I'm talking about religion, right? But I'm really talking about how the human brain believes anything. You know, tarot cards or, you know, all the stuff that the skeptics think is not true, that tons of people believe. It's how we believe anything, you know, and why we believe stuff, and why we don't have a more critical brain, and how our social brain is recently developed. Our ability to input sensory stuff, and our ability to process it abstractly, and our ability to use it socially to bind us together, these are relatively recently evolved features of our brain that frequently don't work perfectly. and we don't have a bullshit detector program. You know, and so for example, if you go to an IMAX, and nowadays they have these fabulous IMAXs, right? And you sit in an IMAX and you watch it, right? You're on a roller coaster. Try convincing your body that you're not really on a roller coaster. If the information is coming into your brain in the right programming language, your brain does with it what your brain does with it, regardless of if it's real or not. Your brain doesn't have this separate detector that detects, oh, this is real and this is not real. If it comes in the right language, your brain processes it and does it. So when people believe about this, if you look at all religious beliefs all around the world, they're all very similar. They always believe in one supreme God who has a single counterintuitive trait, not multiple counterintuitive traits. You can only get away with about one counterintuitive trait, like he's either invisible, or he's a guy who throws lightning and it's thunder, or he's a snake, but he's really a man. But it's usually a man-like person who has one single counterintuitive trait, and he ultimately provides a set of rules for us to live by, and he can do bad to you, or he can do good to you. So our brains are programmed to detect exactly that individual. If you think about it, when we're running around as hunters-and-gatherers in small groups, because of our ability to do teamwork, we rose to the top of the food chain. Our only enemies were other groups of small groups of humans. We could be infiltrated. We were always constantly had to be alert for interacting with other groups, right? So we have programming that detects, you know, if we come across a new person, are you going to hurt us or are you going to help us? We have programming that does that, right? So it's not very far to apply that. Just like Nikki playing with a toy, I mean, she's programmed to play with nuts and berries, not a toy, right? But we're programmed, you know, to detect intruders in our small hunting gathering group. But we can use that programming to conceive of a deity, and it's a very easy thing for us to believe because we're programmed, you know, to believe that sort of thing.
So we're out of time. Sorry, but thank you very much.
Oh, I missed the time.